Why do we have political theory in veganism at all? Isn't veganism such a simple idea that any child can understand it? Isn't veganism such a simple idea that it doesn't need volumes and volumes of academic discourse on the political philosophy of how to implement? You know, political theory can get you into trouble, but it also helps get you out of trouble. It helps avoid problems before they even start. I might take a very simple, very humble, very consumer-centered definition of veganism as the most practical way to talk about veganism, especially to outsiders in most circumstances. Something like this. The central idea of veganism is, if you refuse to buy animal products, you're making the world a better place. If we can convince more and more people to refuse to buy animal products, then collectively, in mass, we are making the world a better place. Of course, you can get into details about in what way we're making the world a better place, in terms of ecology, use of resources like water, in terms of reducing animal suffering, etc., etc. We can expand on this almost infinitely. But that's a very simple and very limited idea. It's very easy for people to understand, and it is implementable. It's very clear how you would put this into practice in your own life. Now, by contrast, right now, 2017, I would say the dominant idea of veganism in the academic discourse, in terms of the political theory of veganism, is to approach it from a wildly different perspective, is to approach veganism as follows. There are people who say the fundamental problem with modern Western civilization is speciesism. You must understand speciesism as a form of oppression. Therefore, veganism is a social justice issue. And speciesism, as they use the concept, entails that to treat an animal as less than a person, to treat an animal as something other than a non-human person, is discrimination parallel to treating black people as inferior to white people or Mongolian people as inferior to Chinese people. This is an argument that relies on the inherent equality, in some sense, of animals and people, and that is claiming that anyone who fails to recognize and respect that equality is a bigot, is equivalent to a racist. They are a speciesist. Now, I do not think the concept of speciesism is completely worthless. I actually think in some contexts, in some conversations, it's meaningful and useful. One that's come up on this channel is when you're challenging people, why do you think that a pig should be treated so differently from a dog? Why do you think that a bear should be treated so differently from a dog? When we're challenging, I think, divisions we have, cultural distinctions we have between different classes of animals, I think it can be useful to talk about speciesism and really to talk about the kind of cultural ideology that we attach to humanity, to the status of particular species. Why is it that people assume, fish don't matter and cats do? In some contexts, it can be meaningful. But approaching veganism in this way, as a matter of fact, we're creating many insoluble problems for ourselves. Gary Francione, likewise, he starts from the speciesist perspective, and then he tries to push very hard on a false dichotomy that the whole world is only separated into persons and inanimate things, objects, persons and objects. Therefore, we must recognize that animals are non-human persons, and therefore we must give animals a set of rights, not quite equal to human rights, and all kinds of absurdities ensue from this, including really a very thin-skinned and hysterical attitude towards anyone who doesn't agree with you. And if you've been in veganism for a long time, you may have gotten out of touch with the fact that to 99% of humanity, the very concept of speciesism is laughable. It's ridiculous, it's hilarious, it's insane. It's actually laugh out loud funny for a meat eater, for someone who's not familiar with this discourse, to hear a vegan claiming that because they regard a rat or a cockroach or a pigeon as inferior to a human being, they are in effect racist. They are speciesist against those animals. Okay? And the reality is, vegans can preach this, they can make this the center of their ethical and political praxis, but vegans do not actually practice it. We do not actually believe in it. The vast majority of people watching this video right now, the vast majority of people watching are living in a major city. Even if you are vegan, I challenge you to take the time to talk to your apartment building manager about the reality of pest control where you live. When I was living in Victoria, BC, Canada, I was living in an apartment that had hollow walls. So the walls, very common in Canada. It's an apartment building, but the walls are hollow. There's a little layer of wood and this artificial facing material. It's a perfect home for rats and cockroaches to live in. The walls, when you have hollow walls like that in Canada, any animals that can move into the building will move in. Rats, cockroaches, bed bugs. Currently, I'm living in a solid concrete building. Very different situation. I remember thinking I was just lucky and that it was just a matter of time before that building had rats, cockroaches, and bed bugs infesting it. And actually, when I moved out, my last couple of days there, when you move out of an apartment, you have to meet up with the building manager a few times. We were discussing these things, and he mentioned to me they had a pest control expert coming in every week. They had someone setting traps for mice and rats, spraying chemicals, not just chemicals to kill insects, but to detect if you've got an infection. If you've got an infestation, to detect the presence of cockroaches and bed bugs and that kind of thing. They were paying a regular fee to have a professional company of exterminators come in like clockwork on a regular basis. And that's why I never saw any of those animals. The reality is my rent money is going to kill animals like rats. The reality is every time you buy bread, you are paying money for that wheat farmer to kill rats. In Canada, rats and groundhogs, many, many other animals. Okay? In practice, we do not believe in equal rights for all animals. We do not believe in this particular paradigm of speciesism, and none of us could live by this definition, by this political theory, if we wanted to. When I lived in Taiwan, yes, pious vegan that I am, I personally can try to avoid killing cockroaches. Taiwan, I have been told, has the world's greatest climate for cockroaches. Cockroaches really flourish there. Okay? When a particular cockroach comes into my house, I can take the time to take a porcelain cup and trap the cockroach and put it outside with the... I can do that, yes. And I can pat myself on the back and say that I'm morally superior to someone else who doesn't take that time. Guess what? When I was in Taiwan, every single day I benefited from the fact that the city government, the local government, was going out and putting poison in the storm drains. To see this poison was remarkable. I think it had dry ice as part of it. It was crackling and emitting fumes. They would put really, really serious pesticides in the storm drains all over the city. The government is actively spraying and killing cockroaches all the time so that my house is not overrun with cockroaches, so that the whole neighborhood is not overrun with cockroaches. And as a vegan, I'm benefiting from that. Okay? Bed bugs are the ultimate example. There's no way to negotiate. If you are a vegan and you have lived in an apartment building with a bed bug infestation, I'd love to see you live up to this principle. Okay? It matters. Why would you embrace a political theory, a political philosophy that, first of all, makes vegans sound ridiculous to outsiders? There's no advantage in that. Second of all, makes vegans appear to be hypocrites to their fellow vegans, gives us a set of principles we can't live by, and thirdly, creates more problems than it solves. Ultimately, what is philosophy? To me, philosophy is a problem-solving method, and then over time, we have the discipline of philosophy of collecting together and studying and examining those problem-solving methods, learning from the contrast and comparison between problem-solving methods. Ultimately, there's no point having a political philosophy at all if it's not going to solve some problem. Okay? And I do see tremendous, unbelievable blind spots in this approach, this speciesism first approach, where the first principle is anti-speciesism, and then we approach veganism. Okay? Wild bears in the forest are not property. Wild bears are not going to be liberated by this switch in focus from regarding animals as property to regarding animals as in some sense equal. It's irrelevant. This approach, really, you can see it's based on the status of domesticated house pets, like dogs and cats, saying dogs and cats should be elevated to have these other rights. And it neither applies in a coherent way to the status of animals in the wild, nor to animals that we regard as vermin, like rats. Okay? So, on the level of rhetoric, it seems to me you're making tremendous sacrifices as a vegan by embracing this model. And what do you get? What is the benefit of this model? The benefit clearly is the use of this term social justice. I've heard Francione say this. I've seen other books, other authors playing this game lately. For some reason, some vegans, including Francione, are very much afraid anyone who does not regard veganism as a social justice movement, whatever that means, it's a painfully vague phrase. If you don't regard it as a matter of social justice, then you'll merely be a reducitarian. You'll merely try to ameliorate the situation with the slaughterhouse industry. You won't try to abolish it absolutely. Now, I really don't know. To me, that's an illogical and incoherent leap of inference. I also think, I've been recently reading this book. Probably in the future I'll have more discussion of this book, and I'll invite other YouTubers to come on and maybe discuss it with me. The same way with Mod Vegan before. We had a great discussion of Gary Francione's latest book. There's a new book, 2016, Motivational Methods for Vegan Motivational Methods for Vegan Advocacy by Casey Taft, PhD. So, interesting book, like most of this stuff, somewhat flawed. 2016 book, contribution to the literature on veganism in theory and in practice as a social movement, how to convert new people to veganism. When I look at passages of this book that lean so heavily on this word social justice, I often question myself, and I sort of question the author, why not write what you really mean? Why not write, I look at a sentence that just throws in this term social justice as an adjective. What do you gain by saying animal agriculture is a social justice issue? I think what you really mean is animal agriculture is an injustice that our whole society ought to care about. That's really the meaning of this sentence. But social justice itself has become a very strange, abstract catchphrase. And it's very strange for me to see people, on the one hand, really arguing at length, that veganism must be a social justice movement. Again, Francione does that, Casey Taft does that, et cetera, et cetera. If it's not a social justice movement, then we're going to disintegrate into merely being vegetarians or reducitarians. To me, that's completely illogical. And then also the idea that we must form veganism in the image of a social justice movement. We basically have to imitate a preconceived ideal, a preconceived bunch of assumptions about how social justice movements work, because veganism is supposed to be a social justice movement. This is the ultimate self-defeating political philosophy, right? Why? Look, comparisons are odious, okay? An allegory can easily become a trap. Yes, we can speak allegorically about the ways in which veganism may resemble struggles for civil rights for African Americans in the history of the States. We can talk about that. It's an allegory, okay? But we can also talk about the ways in which veganism is similar to efforts to get labeling on cigarette packages, health reforms, legal reforms related to trying to abolish cigarettes. We can talk about, I love this example, how well organized and successful Mothers Against Drunk Driving was, movements. We can talk about the seatbelt reforms. We can look at all kinds of examples of well organized, highly successful social movements that were not necessarily social justice movements. And we can learn from all of those comparisons. And none of the comparisons is going to be perfect. Okay? There's no point. Don't send me hate mail giving me a list of all the reasons why organizing vegans to advocate for veganism is fundamentally different from organizing people to try to prevent drunk driving, try to change our culture of alcohol consumption. It is different in some ways. But do you want to make a list of how different veganism is from the abolition of slavery in the American Civil War? Do you think there's going to be a vegan civil war? All right? My main criteria here, I mentioned earlier how absurd and ridiculous the speciesist first approach is, where speciesism is the main item in your logical, theoretical approach. I have mentioned at the beginning that outsiders regard that as ridiculous. But I do not think that's the most important criterion. I think if you have a really well-working philosophy, if you've got a political theory that really works and you can put into practice, that really solves problems for you, then maybe it's okay if outsiders think it's ridiculous, because over time, outsiders are going to see how it works in practice. You're going to prove the viability of that political theory. For me, fundamentally, the problem with this kind of approach is that it is incoherent even within veganism. It's actually counterproductive and self-defeating. I mean that very sincerely. Okay? So I'm going to read a couple of passages here from Casey Taft, PhD, Motivational Methods for Vegan Advocacy. I guess I can give a link below this video. If anyone else wants to read that book, again, I think in the next few weeks, there's going to be more discussion of that book on my channel. Maybe I'll invite some other YouTubers on to talk about it. Okay? Quote, page 19, quote, "For every social justice movement that has led to great change, those at the forefront were able to change the way that we see certain oppressed groups, such as women, people of color, non-straight people, trans people, and so on. The same is needed for animal advocacy and a shift towards veganism." Okay, pause. Really? So logically here, on the level of political philosophy, what is he doing? He's saying we must treat social justice movements, already a painfully vague category. Really, he's primarily talking about civil rights for African Americans. We must treat that as the template. We must treat that as the pattern for veganism to imitate or to aspire to. Okay? Why? It's an incredibly weak argument. There is an allegory. There is a comparison we can make between animal rights and the abolition of slavery. Yes, but it's only one comparison. Other people make the comparison to the extermination of Jews by the Nazis and the Holocaust. It's a comparison. I understand why people make that comparison. Often they're interested in even the aesthetics of the gas chamber, because gas chambers are now being used to kill chickens. The aesthetics of the actual, equipment used for this kind of mass slaughter. It's a comparison. It's evocative. Do you think really there are lessons we can learn from World War II and how the Nazis were defeated that we're going to apply to the slaughterhouse industry, that we're going to apply to McDonald's? No. Do you actually think we're going to fight a civil war to abolish speciesism in the same way that, do you think there's going to be a civil war against McDonald's? There are so many obvious ways in which we should have the maturity to just say, yeah, you know what, this is one comparison. This is one interesting question to ask, but it's only one comparison of many. There's no way that this should be a mold for veganism to pour itself into, okay? And again, on a psychological level, you can say to somebody, look, humanity had to learn that when you regard a black person, you should basically regard them in the same way you regard a white person. There are differences between black people and white people, but you know what? They're kind of trivial. You have to set them aside and relate to this black person as your equal, or you have to relate to them in the same way you would relate to a white person. Basically, that's the psychological aspect of racial equality, right? Okay, so we all understand the discourse. How are you going to apply that to a rat? How are you going to apply that to a cockroach? How are you going to apply that to a bear in a forest? And why are we even fucking asking the question in that way? I realize there are people who have been inside the movement and inside the academic discourse for so long that they don't see why that's problematic or counterproductive. Okay? But taking the art, starting from the position, you have to look into the eyes of a bear in the forest and see him as your equal. You have to overcome your speciesist aversion to this bear or this rat or these bed bugs that are infesting your house. Really? You really think that's the most effective way to approach this, even within the vegan? Really? The same is needed for animal advocacy, he says, and a shift toward veganism. We will never be able to shift the paradigm for animals if we continue to go along with the oppressive notion that we can ethically do harm to animals in moderation. Okay, well, my approach is completely different, Casey. Okay, Casey Taft is the author here. I think that just like war and peace, ultimately, the way humans relate to animals relies on lines being drawn on a map. I think that ultimately human beings draw lines on a map and they say, inside this area, inside this zone, we are going to preserve the forest and we are going to preserve bears living in the wild in their natural habitat. And humans are not even allowed to feed the bears. We are not allowed to domesticate the bears. We're not allowed to have them in a circus performing for us. We're not allowed to even give them food because that leads to dependency, etc. Okay? But you know what? If the bears cross the line, and that happens, it's completely inevitable that some of the bears are going to smell human garbage, or just out of curiosity, we're not going to have perfect barriers. Once in a while, bears leave the forest and break into somebody's basement. Happens all the time in Canada. They force their way through the windows and end up in somebody's basement. Okay, and you know what? Human beings are going to shoot the bears dead. It would be better if they could use a tranquilizer gun. It would be better if you could just tranquilize the bear and return it to the forest. That would be better. Okay? But Casey, I actually do not believe that bears have equal rights to human beings. I have sympathy for everyone involved. If I had to shoot a bear in my own basement in Canada, I'm sure I'd be traumatized and horrified. Or if I call the cops and the cops show up and shoot the bear, it's awful. I'm not celebrating it. Okay? I'm not celebrating it as a sport. But if you start from this perspective, that all animals should be treated as non-human persons with the same rights as people, because you're hung up on this bullshit social justice paradigm, because you're hung up on this speciesist paradigm, because you approach this as if the problem with Western civilization is the riddle of the difference between objects and persons, that only persons have rights. You've created a political theory that is worse than having no political theory at all. Okay? You're not solving problems with this theory. You're only creating problems. This is really self-defeating and destructive for the movement, and I know you can't see it that way. That's why I'm making this video. I know you're only trying to help. I know you're only trying to make the world a better place. But these are fundamental assumptions built into your book and built into many, many people right now in the abolitionist side of veganism. Even this is built into the so-called citizenship side, abolitionists and citizenship approach. We need to think about this from a different angle. Okay? To examine whether we are treating animal use as a social justice issue, all we need to do is to hypothetically place an oppressed human group in the place of non-human animals. Okay, pause. Really? I understand where he's going with this. Most of you already know where he's going with this. Really? Can we really ask ourselves, this bear, do we treat this bear the same way we would treat an oppressed human being? Whether the bear is in the forest or the bear has come into the city and is starting to cause trouble for people. Do we treat rats the same way as an oppressed human being? Do we treat bed bugs and cockroaches? No, we don't. We're never going to. Okay? Not in the city, not in our homes, not on the farms where we raise fruit and vegetables and wheat. All of those forms of farming kill animals and not just insects. I remember a video maybe 2 years ago where Durian Rider, more than 1 year ago, Durian Rider was just reflecting on how much he would love to own and operate his own farm. I remember he always used the term a mature fruit farm. I remember him using with this. This is back when Durian Rider felt he had a lot of money to burn. I don't know if he still feels that way. And I remember watching the video thinking, Durian Rider, do you have any idea what kind of work is involved in running a farm? And this was specifically, his fantasy was a fruit farm in Thailand. Okay? In Thailand, on a fruit farm, you don't just kill rats, You don't just kill gophers. I don't think they have gophers. You kill pigs. You kill monkeys. Okay? You take a fucking rifle and you shoot monkeys that come onto the farm to take the fruit. I live in the real world. I do not live in an imaginary playpen where we can pretend that in any of these interactions we treat animals equal to human beings. We don't. And we're never going to. My approach is the wildlife management approach. I want to draw lines on a map and say, over there, bears live and die on their own terms. Yes, with some intervention from humans. You know, if a plague breaks out, if the bears are all going extinct, for sure, there's some level. Park wardens are like this for a national park. If there's some disease that breaks out, some level of veterinary care, there are some kinds of intervention to prevent overpopulation or, you know, species extinction within a park. Sure, there are some role for humans overseeing wildlife in a national park, in a zone fenced off to be for the wilderness. But that's about it, folks. I neither see animals as our equals and our partners within this society, nor as our equals in any of these contexts. And I'll tell you something, my model works, because my model solves more problems than it causes. I got an email a few days ago asking me about, I'm live streaming while I do this. I've got questions now coming in about managing deer population and so on. Great questions. I got a question a few days ago asking me about backyard chickens. And this was somebody who approached veganism from instead this, not my perspective, I guess from the common perspective. And this person really sincerely felt that my approach, the wildlife management approach, fails to address whether or not it's okay to eat eggs from chickens raised in your backyard in a coop, but it's the world's most comfortable chicken coop. All this bullshit, this animal welfarist approach bullshit, right? And I was able to write back and say, look, you obviously haven't watched even one of my videos on what the wildlife management approach to veganism is and why I argue it. Okay? Not only do I think it's immoral for you to eat the chicken's eggs that are raised in your backyard, I not only do I think it's immoral for you to raise them in captivity of any kind, I think it's immoral for you to feed the chickens. My philosophy can be summed up with a sign we've all seen. Please do not feed the bears. I do not want animals to have a relationship of dependency on human beings at all. I reject domestication of animals entirely. Okay? The bears in the forest should try to feed themselves, and when they can't feed themselves, they should starve. That's the life of a bear in the wild. Period. Dogs should not be our pets. We should not pretend that dogs are our friends. Dogs should exist only in the wild where they can feed themselves or starve. And guess what, folks? It's literally a dog-eat-dog world. If you know anything about how dogs exist in the wild, dogs do kill and eat other dogs. Right? And there's a line on the map, and I don't think the bears have the right to come in and live in the city. I don't think the bears have the right to come in and eat the garbage out of your garbage can. Obviously, it's dangerous. And the practical reality is, do you know any philosophy of veganism that even addresses the question of how do we raise fruit or how do we farm wheat if we actually believe in this bullshit that we should treat the rats and the gophers as having rights equal to human rights? It's a pretty obvious flaw, okay, people, on the level of political theory. This is not a tiny or subtle problem in this approach, okay? My approach, again, is simple and obvious. You draw lines on a map. In one area, animals have all the rights in the world, the forest, the national park, whatever you're going to say. And in another area, whether it's the city or a farm, basically we have a different set of rights, a different set of principles. And we would never treat human beings that way. We would never draw lines on a map and say, okay, over there is the First Nations reserve where Native Canadians or Native Americans live, and as long as they stay on that reserve, they have human rights, but if they cross the line and come into white society, then all of a sudden it's different. We would never do that to human beings. In Canada, we have a terrible history of doing exactly that to human beings, right? So there are some comparisons. Some. But I don't think we can think our way out of this problem via speciesism or via this idea that we have to declare animals to be so-called non-human persons. It's ridiculous and counterproductive. Okay? I continue. Casey Taft, quoting Casey Taft here. Right. So I've already questioned this. Why is he framing this in terms of a social justice issue? What does that phrasing win us? Why aren't we instead making comparisons to the abolition of cigarettes, step by step, including new laws about where you can smoke, where you can't, new laws about how the cigarettes are packaged, the labels, limits on advertising cigarettes. Can you imagine? So this is all bullshit. This species is shit. Look, what a breakthrough it would be if we had a law making it illegal to pay money to advertise meat and dairy products. That would be an epoch-making law. Many, many Western countries have those laws against advertising cigarettes. They restrict the right of companies to advertise tobacco or completely eliminate it, right? Where you can't have billboards up advertising cigarettes because we know cigarettes are bad. That would be a huge, huge advance if we said, look, eggs and bacon are scientifically proven to be terrible for your health, so no more advertising for them. Make that illegal. Be a huge, huge advance, huge, huge win for veganism. But it has nothing to do with this. It wouldn't have anything to do with claiming pigs are non-human persons or that kind of legal reform, right? So there are comparisons to the cigarette smoking struggle, which is a long-term struggle. The next 100 years, we're not going to see tobacco disappear, but it's a real political struggle. Regulating cigarettes out of existence, step by step, over the next 200 years. It's a struggle that has meaningful comparisons to veganism. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, I've mentioned a million times, maybe the most successful civil society organization in the history of the United States of America. Tremendous political influence. And again, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, you think they were a joke? They're doing classroom instruction sessions in high schools across America. Thousands and tens of thousands of high schools have a representative from Mothers Against Drunk Driving coming in and giving them a lecture. Do vegans have anything like that? You think it's a bullshit comparison? It's not. The Civil War, the American Civil War, is not the only meaningful comparison here, guys. And those are not social justice issues. Cigarette smoking, not a social justice issue, not a human rights issue. Drunk driving, alcohol, changing the culture of alcohol drinking, not a social justice issue, not a human rights issue. And guys, the biggest blind spot of all here is just ecology itself. Okay? Ecology is not a social justice issue. And on some level, all of us know, we wouldn't even dispute, veganism is an ecological issue and vice versa, right? Ecology defined in terms of the water, in terms of the air, in terms of the forest, in terms of habitat conservation, in terms of the melting of the polar ice caps, none of them are social justice issues. So why take social justice as a straitjacket that veganism has to fit into? Doesn't make sense. Okay? So he continues, not going to read too much more of this. For example, quote, for example, would we ever promote only a reduction in racism or a baby steps approach towards ending racism rather than demanding a complete end to racist practices? Would we encourage those who engage in domestic violence to merely reduce their physical violence towards their partners, or would we demand that society refuses to not condone any intimate partner violence? Look, guys, to me, this is complete bullshit written by someone who has no experience in the real world of political science or politics, full stop, period. Guess what? Tolerance does matter. Guess what? Most countries have made a transition lasting 500 years about racism. And if you want to have a society that, right in 1955, locked up every white American who made a racist statement and put them in jail, then American society would have disintegrated, right? In reality, America did go through baby steps. I'm not glorifying it, but the American transition from slavery to racial equality, even in the 20th century, it was a long series of baby steps, and there had to be tolerance on both sides. There had to be tolerance for maybe extreme, black liberation groups, and there had to be tolerance to the fact that there were a lot of people's mean old white grandparents making racist statements, and we all had to live in a society together without having another civil war, without being in a constant state of civil war. Because guess which side ultimately would have won? If you're talking about the uplifting of the oppressed and the weak. Tolerance does matter, even with an example like, domestic partner violence, as he says. Okay? we have huge problems in Canada. I'm sure this exists in the U.S. or some states in the U.S. where the police on paper have a zero tolerance policy towards wife beating or husband beating, domestic partner violence. We have this situation all the time. A couple comes home from the bar, they're in their apartment, they're drunk, and they're yelling at each other. And one of their neighbors calls the cops. When the cops show up, they beat the crap out of both people. They beat up the husband and the wife. They put the husband in handcuffs and take him off to jail. And it has huge negative impacts on the couple's lives. And sometimes the wife is saying, he never even beat me. This is ridiculous. They were just yelling at each other and the neighbors didn't want to hear it. I've heard lots of stories of that from the States. Actually, I hate to tell you, in practice, in terms of actually policing and legislating how you handle something like domestic partner violence, real life is not about making demands. Real life is not just about demanding equality and then assuming that demand will solve the problem. Real life is full of these terrible gray areas. How do you actually manage the transition from an intensely racist society to a broadly speaking egalitarian society? How do you actually manage on a human level and in terms of legislation the protocol for what police should do when someone phones them because they can hear screaming, two people screaming at each other in the next apartment? Okay? This is actually laughable, and I know people inside the movement don't realize how laughable and ignorant this is. Okay? With racism, I'll give you an example. It was crucially important, absolutely crucially important, in basically every Western country in the world, to have racial equality laws when a bank considers an application for a loan. It was in the not so distant past, but in the 1950s, a black person could not buy a house or could not get money loaned to them to build their own house in the same way a white person could. Crucial institutional change to try to bring them up. But on the other hand, in the United States of America, they never had laws that forced a Christian preacher in a white-only church to stop saying racist things against black people. They never deprived that person of their freedom of speech. Okay? So it is complicated. And he says you cannot possibly solve these problems through baby steps. On the contrary, he's choosing examples of problems that are only solved through baby steps. Ultimate self-defeating approach to veganism. Okay, while individual advocates may not think of themselves as speciesist, he continues, Casey Taft, they promote a speciesist paradigm when they convey acceptance of any non-human animal abuse that would never, under any circumstances, be considered acceptable if human animals were those experiencing the injustice. Okay, so to me, I guess that's a good point to wrap up on. It's just absurd. It's just absurd. Sometimes we shoot bears. I mean, sometimes we shoot people too. If you really try to sit down and legislate, what rights do bears have when they're in the forest? What rights do bears have when they cross the barrier and come into the city? What rights do bears have when they come into a human home and are in the basement? There is no way you could start from or end with this standard that we can never treat bears. We can never treat bears in a way we wouldn't treat a person. If it would be an injustice to treat a person this way, therefore you can't treat a bear this way. And bears are pretty easy, folks. What are you going to do with the rats? What are you going to do with the cockroaches? What are you going to do with millions of cows? If just one factory farm shut down and decided to liberate all its cows, what are you going to do with those cows? Domesticated cows, as they exist on a farm, they can't survive in the wild. What are you going to do with those cows if just one farm owner turns vegan and liberates his cows and donates thousands of cows to an animal shelter? Okay, there are all kinds of impossible to solve problems here. And meanwhile, in the midst of all this, I think the majority of you vegans watching this video, you have pet cats. Every day, you're paying money to kill a cow, to put the cow's flesh in a fucking metal can so you can feed it to your cat. So would you do that with a human being? Would you buy human meat to feed your cat? It's not a workable or useful political theory. It's just not. So I come back to this. Look, fundamentally, veganism is a praxis in search of a political theory. Veganism is a working method that lacks a political philosophy. And that is much, much better than being in the situation of having a political philosophy that lacks any method. We all know what to do with veganism. We know how to take this method and put it into practice. And I think that's because my first definition, what I said at the start of this video, is really the true and more useful definition. At core, at bottom, the method or the conceit of veganism is, if everyone stopped paying for animal products, the world would be a better place. Would that solve all of our problems? No. But if everyone did what I do every day and just refused to buy animal products, the world would be a better place. Okay? Simple. Does that mean that rats will have equal rights to human beings? No. Does that mean that we're going to abolish wheat farming because wheat farming involves killing gophers and rats and mice? No. Does it mean that if a bear breaks into your house, you have to treat it the same way you would a human? No, it doesn't have any of those implications. All right? That's just the core consumerist praxis, the method we all agree to as vegans. And we could leave it at that.